The lectures you're about to see cover the last 3,000 years of Western intellectual history. They cover most of the important problems in Western thought and high culture, and they will involve a kind of thinking that most people don't spend most of their time doing. It's called philosophy. The word philosophy comes from two Greek words, the words for love and wisdom, or knowledge. And philosophy is more or less a love of wisdom, a sort of passion for knowledge, which goes beyond what we can get from it, which goes beyond practical concerns. And the intellectual tradition of the West forms a more or less coherent philosophic tradition with a common set of problems, a roughly similar set of issues under consideration, and a similar set of vocabulary words that we use to inquire into philosophical topics. And we might as well consider these vocabulary, these set of terms that we use now, in order to prevent misapprehensions later on. In the first case, we're going to talk about physics and metaphysics. Physics might be thought of as our theory of nature. And roughly speaking, what it means is it's our way of explaining the world around us, the world of sense perception, the world of tables and chairs and of the component parts of tables and chairs, and of the larger things that we encounter, suns, galaxies, worlds, things like that. Our general theory of the world of space and time around us might be described from a philosophical standpoint as being physics. Another set of philosophical issues, another philosophic problem or topic that comes along with our consideration of physics is metaphysics. Metaphysics comes from Greek words meaning above or beyond physics or nature. What we mean by metaphysics is a set of ideas or entities that exist independently of the world of space and time, that aren't the kind of things that tables and chairs and rocks and stars are. Examples of metaphysics are pure ideas, or spiritual entities like God or the angels, things like that for religious believers. In every case, though, metaphysics suggests that there's something to the world, that there's something real and existing that exists independent of and somehow outside of our immediate everyday experience. So metaphysics is the inquiry and the consideration of things that exist outside of nature itself, pure ideas and religious objects of religious thought. In addition to physics and metaphysics, we'll also be considering two related questions, ontology and logic. Now, ontology is not the kind of word you're going to see on an everyday basis. It's not the kind of thing you're most likely going to find in the newspaper. But ontology is not a terribly hard thing to comprehend. It's speech about beings. In other words, ontology is a kind of philosophical discipline which allows us to analyze and think about the kind of existence that things have. For example, we might say that God exists in a different way and on a different plane from everyday human beings. We might be inclined to say that human beings have a status and a set of rights and a kind of dignity that everyday objects don't have. In other words, when we distinguish between human beings and physical objects, or between God and human beings, we're making what might be called ontological distinctions. We're distinguishing between the kinds of beings that they are. We're attributing to them different status in a sort of hierarchy, perhaps, and we're distinguishing the kind of speech that we can make about them, the kind of reasoning that we can do about them, and the kind of thing that they are. There are differences in the way we apprehend different ontological classes of beings. So ontology is just going to be speech about beings. It sounds simple early on. It won't be too bad. I'll come back to this topic of ontology later because it's pregnant with many important philosophical questions. In addition to ontology, we're going to talk about logic a little bit. Logic is a kind of formidable term. It's a little bit intimidating when you first encounter it. It's nothing quite as complicated as you might think. Logic is a system of rules for deriving true inferences. In other words, logic is a series of rules which says that if you start out with true premises, if you follow the rules of logic, you will always draw true inferences. So it's nothing very complicated, nothing as intimidating as you might have suspected. Logic is just a set of rules for organizing our thinking so that we always get the right answer if we start out with true assumptions. It's not as bad as you might have thought. Well, in addition to questions of logic and ontology, we also have questions of epistemology. Now, epistemology, another large kind of intimidating word, but it's simpler than you might suspect. It comes from two Greek words, episteme and logos, meaning speech or reasoning about knowledge itself. When we inquire into epistemology, what we're doing is thinking about knowledge, trying to account, first of all, for what sort of things we can know about, and second of all, we're trying to account for what kind of knowledge we can have of different kinds of things. So, for example, our knowledge of arithmetic may be different from our knowledge of the boiling point of water. Our knowledge of the boiling point of water may be different from our knowledge of right and wrong. Our knowledge of right and wrong may be different from our knowledge of political theory or the way that governments ought to be organized. In every case, different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of thinking involve epistemological distinctions and epistemological thinking. It involves thinking about thinking. When philosophers do this, they are trying to clarify their own thoughts and clarify the thoughts of other people to eliminate confusions that have crept into people's thinking by providing a specific and detailed analysis of how thinking works, what thinking can do, and then giving examples of the appropriate sort of thinking. So all through this long series of lectures that we're going to be doing on the history of Western philosophy, questions of epistemology will be central to our concerns. And when you hear the word epistemology, it's nothing to get excited about. The philosopher in question is just doing a little thinking about thinking. He's just doing a little talk about what it means to be reasonable, about what it means to think clearly. In addition to talking about epistemology, every philosophy that talks about knowledge also has to talk about a theory of the knower, because whenever there's knowledge, there's also some person doing the knowing. And a theory of knowledge and a theory of the knower always lead to a sort of philosophical psychology. Either explicitly or implicitly, all of the philosophers in the Western tradition have a particular conception of the human mind and the human consciousness which is characteristic of and cognate to their entire philosophical project. Different sorts of philosophical psychologies, different conceptions of the mind, will be characteristic of different philosophers and will come to light when we have different kinds of questions to consider. Plato had one particular philosophy of mind, and he organized his philosophy of mind, or of the soul, with particular reference to the problems of justifying mathematical knowledge. The philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, who were at the heyday of the rise of modern science, put together different and alternative conceptions of philosophical psychology based upon different concerns with regard to epistemology. Their concerns in the 17th and 18th century were primarily with justifying the rise of modern natural science, and their philosophy of mind correspondingly differs in the sort of emphasis that they place upon different topics. Beyond the philosophy of mind, we're also going to have three related disciplines. And the first will be aesthetics. What we mean by aesthetics is a theory of the beautiful, a series of reasoned conclusions or reasoned thoughts about what it is that human beings find beautiful, whether this beauty that they apprehend is in the object that they're looking at or observing, or whether it's in the psyche, whether it's in the mind itself, and what the role of beauty is in the rest of our judgments. For example, in our judgments of right and wrong, our judgments of political order and change, and our judgments of the way that we ought to live our own particular lives. Aesthetics will be a way of formalizing and making rigorous our everyday, perhaps odds and ends, not terribly well organized feelings about beauty. Aesthetics brings together our series of common everyday thoughts about what's beautiful and attractive and formulates them into a philosophical whole that connects them to other philosophical questions like ethics, ontology, epistemology. Two other philosophic topics or philosophic questions will be discussed repeatedly in the course of these lectures on the history of philosophy. The first is ethics, and the second is politics, or more precisely, political theory. Ethics is the theory, or the philosophic branch of inquiry, which talks about right and wrong, which talks about our moral obligations, which inquires into our certainty of what we ought and ought not to do. Ethics asks, what is it to be a human being and to engage in actions that are appropriate to a human being? How can we improve the way we behave, and how can we make adequate or satisfactory judgments of the behavior of other people? Ethics investigates the part of human beings that are not animals, that are not specifically, completely part of nature. It investigates the element in human beings which make choices, which are free, which in the ancient intellectual tradition have souls. Ethics inquires into the sort of activities we undertake, the sort of judgments of value that we make, and the sort of people we are or could become. Now, connected with these concerns is the philosophy of politics, or political theory. The reason why politics is connected to ethics is because, at least in the ancient tradition of politics and ethics, one is directly connected to the other because the city, or the human collectivity, is seen as being like an individual human soul, only raised in size, increased in proportions. So if it is true that the human individual is like human society in some respects, or for some purposes, then at its basis, political theory, the theory of political science, the theory of how we ought to organize societies, of how governments ought to be organized, of how justice ought to be dispensed, will all be connected with our theories of ethics and with our conceptions of proper human behavior. In other words, both ethics and politics investigate the theory of what is good or what is righteous. Ethics investigates what is good or righteous at the level of the individual. Politics investigates what is good or righteous or praiseworthy or justifiable at the level of society. So at the level of the individual, ethics tells us what we ought to do. At the level of society, political theory or political science or political philosophy will investigate the way societies are organized, the way they ought to behave, the kind of laws they ought to create, and the kind of political order, the kind of connections between human beings it ought to establish and justify. So the concerns of the history of philosophy are remarkably small given the vast variety of thinkers in the history of philosophy, the enormous diversity and richness of the traditions they represent, and the vast amounts of time that we're talking about. When we consider the history of philosophy, we must always consider the fact that we are dropping back 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 centuries. So on our part, it will require an imaginative leap. We are going to have to think our way back to the position of early philosophers, of early thinkers, of early cultures that don't have the advantage of the historical experience that we do, that don't have the advantage of the sophisticated technological advances that we do, that don't have any of the presuppositions that we bring to questions of right and wrong, to questions of justice and injustice, to questions of truth and falsehood. The ancient world that philosophy originated from was a world full of myths, a world full of imaginative stories, which took the place of rational explanations of things. So when we treat the history of philosophy, we have to come to it with an open mind and a willingness to think ourselves back out of the level of sophistication that we happen to be in today, back to the level of the problems and the level of the perplexity of the ancients. If you're willing to make that sort of intellectual leap and perform that kind of intellectual sympathy or empathy with earlier thinkers, your chances of absorbing and appreciating these philosophical debates increases dramatically. Now, I spoke earlier about ontology, about the question of what is, and that topic is going to be very important in our analysis and our breaking down, our consideration of the entire history of Western philosophy. There are basically only two answers to the question what is. It's such a simple question that you can see how it wouldn't provide a great many alternatives at the most fundamental level. There are two basic answers to the question of what is in the Western tradition. The first answer to the question is that what is nature. That is to say, there's simply tables and chairs and objects of sense perception. That there are no gods or spirits or demons or anything mystical, anything non-physical, anything non-sensible. In other words, there's a whole school of philosophy, dates all the way back to the ancient Greek pre-Socratic physicists, which treats the world as simply made up of atoms and the void, or matter and space. There is no room for a second world. There's no room for God or angels or spirits or anything that's independent of human sense perceptions. So for those philosophers who believe that the world is basically natural, who approach nature as being ontologically fundamental, these people will be the origins of materialistic interpretations of the world. Those people who take nature to be fundamental and exclusively the only thing that exists are going to end up being the kind of ancestors of the philosophical materialists. Now, there's a second group of philosophers and a second answer to the question of what is. In the Western intellectual tradition, an alternative to insisting that only nature exists is the possibility of saying that nature plus something else exists. Some second world, some world outside of our immediate sense perceptions, some world that's external to space and time. And in the Western intellectual tradition, this world is usually called heaven, or hell, or some transcendent realm where divine things are kept outside this profane world of space and time that we encounter on an everyday level. For all believing Christians and Jews, the answer to what exists has to be the world around us, which is nature, but also God and the saints, or the souls of those who have gone on before us, and also things like angels. In other words, for those who are religious believers, for example, there is a second world independent of the world of space and time that has an ontologically distinct set of things within it. Things like God, the angels, moral virtue, perhaps for some philosophers. There will be abstractions. There will be things independent of our senses. It's like that line in Hamlet where Hamlet says, "There are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio." Well, it may well be that those naturalistic philosophers are mistaken, and perhaps there is a second world where things that are not objects of sense perception, which do not exist within the realm of space and time, are kept and connect somehow to our world. In addition to the tradition of religious belief in Western thought, there's also a Greek tradition of metaphysics, a Greek otherworldly tradition, which says that the world is broken into two pieces. There's a world of nature, a world of immediate sense perception, the world of space and time, and a second world, the world of the forms. In many respects, this second world is like the Christian or Jewish heaven. It's an extra world where something divine, something of superlative importance, rains down its significance and its will on this world of space and time that human beings happen to live in. In the case of Plato, and the Greek metaphysical tradition, this second world is called the realm of the forms, and the realm of the forms is a place of pure ideas, of pure thought, that's somehow more real, more permanent, more everlasting than this world of becoming, this world of change, this world of flux that we inhabit. So there are basically two answers in the Western intellectual tradition to the question of what exists. Answer number one to the question is nature. Nature exists, the world of space and time. The pre-Socratic physicists were the first and most important examples of people who held the view that the only real thing is the world of space and time, the world of nature. In addition, modern science, particularly the modern science that develops in the Renaissance and then in the Enlightenment, is very much beholden to this tradition of secular knowledge that comes to the West from the pre-Socratic physicists. So this naturalistic approach to knowledge and this naturalistic approach to what is leads to some of the most fruitful and important elements in the Western intellectual tradition, and it's about half of the significant thinkers, I would say, in the entire tradition have made that ontological assumption. The other half of the centrally important thinkers in the Western tradition adopted the two worlds position, adopted what we would call a metaphysical set of assumptions about ontology. For people that hold this view, there is a world of space and time, there's a world of sense perceptions, but there's also some other world. And this view is something that both Platonists and Christians can agree upon. There's some world external to our sense perceptions, external to the world of change and flux around us, which is permanent, which is of supreme importance, and which it is the obligation of every human being to somehow connect themselves to insofar as they're capable. This second world, for those philosophers who believe in such a thing, this second world is of enormous significance. It contains all our potential for virtue. It contains some eternal moral standards by which to judge the good and evil of human actions. And it somehow justifies and punishes good and evil actions down here. This will be true for Plato. This will be true for the God of Christianity and Judaism. This will be true for all constructs which allow for the existence of that second world, of that metaphysical realm. These two ontological positions, the one world view and the two world view, the view that everything is physics and everything is space and time, and the view that things are space and time plus something else, that the world is nature plus something else. This is the ontological bedrock of the Western intellectual tradition. All of the remaining intellectuals that you're going to hear about throughout this entire series of lectures will have something to say about this ontological question. And once they commit themselves one way or another to this ontological position of one world or the alternative ontological position of two worlds, all sorts of implications are carried on and entailed in that. A certain view of ethics will come from each position, a certain view of politics will come out of each position, a certain view of aesthetics, of the philosophy of mind, of epistemology, all sorts of profound intellectual decisions will be made on the basis of what school of philosophy we find ourselves connected to. So you have to be careful throughout the history of philosophy to get a sense early on of what sort of philosopher you're dealing with. Once you know whether he's a one-world philosopher or a two-world philosopher, much of what follows in his philosophy will make a great deal more sense, because all of philosophy forms one coherent whole, at least among the best thinkers. Now, in addition to the questions of ontology, there's the question of historical development in the Western tradition. And if we look at the Western tradition as a kind of vast panorama of ideas and thinkers and formulations of old and sometimes new contributions to thought, two places and two traditions stand out as being central and fundamental to the Western intellectual endeavor. And I'd say this is the tradition that comes out of Athens and the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem. The tradition that comes from liberated rationality and human freedom, and the tradition that comes from reverence and piety and faith in God. These are the two parts of a braid that the intellectual life of the West forms when you step back and look at it over the centuries. If any of you know what the caduceus is, the caduceus is the symbol of pharmacy, of the apothecary, of the doctor's art. And what it is a stake with two snakes twined around it, forming a sort of a braid. Well, the traditions of Athens and Jerusalem form that kind of a braid in Western culture. The mythos of Western culture, the fundamental myths, the fundamental orientation towards right and wrong, the fundamental conception of metaphysics that is characteristic of the Western tradition comes out of Jerusalem. It comes out of the stories of the Old and the New Testament. The rational element in the Western tradition, the tradition of humanism, of free, unfettered rationality, the human-centered element in Western intellectual culture comes out of Greece, and to be specific, it comes out of one city, it comes out of Athens. Athens is the home of Socrates, and Socrates can be thought of as the sort of patron saint of free and rational inquiry. Athens is the contributor in the Western culture of the idea that nothing human is foreign to us, that what is potentially true for one human being is accessible to all, that there is one common logos, one common rationality, which unites all of human beings and which will allow them to dispel the darkness of myth and irrationality, which the Greeks think hangs over us like a fog. The Greek tradition is the tradition of free discourse. The Greek tradition is the tradition of rationality without any necessary reference to mythological thinking. And the Greek tradition is organized around the idea of human beings as opposed to gods. There is, of course, a Greek pantheon, and there's no shortage of Greek myths. No one that's aware of Greek tragedy would ever hold that sort of a view. But what is remarkable and unique about Greek culture, as opposed to the other cultures that were contemporaneous with it, is that in Greek culture there is a drive towards secular knowledge. And this is a thorough turnaround from the earlier tradition of thought, which has been entirely organized around myths. Secular knowledge is a new and important idea that comes to us from the secular Greek thinkers, particularly in this case, the Greek pre-Socratic physicists and the Greek sophists. Now, two terms are very important when we look at the history of Western philosophy, both as it comes out of Athens and as it comes out of Jerusalem. The first word is logos, and the second word is mythos. Logos in Greek means speech, word, reason, talk. It means rational discourse, essentially. Now, in Greek philosophy, rational discourse has a preeminent place. The Socratic dialogues are works of art which raise philosophical, rational discourse to the realm of archetypes of thinking, archetypes of approaching knowledge in a particularly rational, humane, man-centered way. The Greek view of logos is free, unfettered rationality. Now, there's an alternative conception of logos which is no less valid. And this is the conception of logos that we find in particularly the New Testament. The New Testament is written in Greek, and that is a fact of enormous consequences for the history of Western thought. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, the Quran is written in Arabic. Alone of the sacred books in the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem, the New Testament, written in Greek, has the most definite affinities to Greek culture, and the constant attempt to unify Athens and Jerusalem, to create a rapprochement between Greek culture and the culture of biblical faith, in large part stems from the fact that Christian intellectuals, by virtue of being able to read Scripture in the original, also have access to the Greek intellectual tradition, which is something that comes packaged with the Greek language that we don't see in the tradition of Rabbinic Judaism, and we don't see in the tradition of exegesis that comes out of the Quran. It has to do with the language that these Scriptures are written in. Now, in the tradition of biblical faith, logos does not mean free, untrammeled reason. It has that connotation because it's taken from the Greek. But in fact, logos means word. The Gospel of John, the first passage, the first verse in the first chapter says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh." The word for word here is logos. And what we mean by "in the beginning was the Word" is that the beginning, the primary Urstuff of the world, the fundamental reality, is the Word of God. Nothing comes prior to that. Nothing is more fundamental. Nothing is more basic. The authoritative, fundamental, divine Word of God is the logos in the sense in which logos is used in the Greek tradition. The fact that both those who are devotees of Athens and those who are devotees of Jerusalem have both been using the same word for one of their favorite things has been the source of an endless amount of confusion and difficulties in the history of Western philosophy. So just to take some of these confusions out early on, there are two ways of thinking about the logos, and perhaps they're not entirely separate. Perhaps there is a divine element, a universal element to free, unfettered human discourse. And perhaps there is some element of the mythical or of the divine or of the more than human in either God's revelation or even in the thought that God might reveal his will to us. In either case, devotees of Athens and Jerusalem have been gerrymandering and playing with the Greek language, with a poor dead language, for many generations now, and it's just as well that you get used to it early on. If you do, it will perhaps remove some of the perplexities that may emerge in the course of our discussions. We have quite a ways to go in our history of Western philosophy. Now there's a second important word in our consideration of Athens and Jerusalem, and that word is mythos. And mythos just means story, or at least, if I want to be a little oversimple about it, it just means story. It's the word from which we derive our term myth. And it's a story, but it's more than a story. It's somehow an archetypical story. It's a story about, we assume, fictional people doing fictional things, yet it's a lie that tells the truth, because this story has a universal applicability independent of the person that is alleged to have done these things. We will find examples of such universally applicable myths if we look at something like, the myth of Oedipus, right, in Greek tragedy, or the Oresteia in Greek tragedy, or for that matter, the Iliad and the Odyssey in Homer. These myths are not just rousing adventure stories. They mean to tell us some moral truth about the human condition, or some truth about the human condition regarding the fact that there is no morality. But either way, you are being told something fundamental about the human condition in these myths, which is not to be despised and not to be disdained simply because it doesn't appear in the form of mathematical equations. It still has something to say, but it says it in an indirect and perhaps ambiguous way. Now, both the Athenian tradition and the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem have their characteristic myths. They have an archetypical myth which describes what it means to be the perfect Athenian, what it means to be the perfect man of Jerusalem. Another way of stating it is that it has a set of myths which describe heroes with perhaps different conceptions of heroism, but heroes who exemplify some virtue which is taken to be fundamental and enormously significant in each of these two intellectual traditions. Let's think about these two exemplary myths and see if we can't fish out some qualities of the tradition of Athens and the tradition of Jerusalem while we think about these. Let's start with the tradition of Jerusalem. Now, there are lots of possible choices because the books of the Bible are so rich and profound that you would be hard-pressed to cover any of the important books of the Bible and not find some figure there whose moral status is such that this myth has something to say to us today. But in going through the Bible, I'm going to go straight to one of my real favorites. And he has a book all to himself. This is the story of Job. And Job is God's faithful servant. Job, in some respects, represents the high point of religious faith. Job is the perfect example of the true religious believer, the man who understands his relationship to God, who understands his relationship to things of this world, and who shows only the deepest and most profound virtue, in the biblical sense, in his relationship to God. For those of you who haven't read the Bible, either lately or ever, let me briefly tell you what the story of Job is. Job is God's faithful servant. He's a real good guy. He constantly does all the things that God requires of him. God has given him a good bit of favor, given him a wife, children, given him wealth, given him land, given him flocks, made him a happy man, a man of this world, a man of many pleasures and many diversions. Constantly, Job performs the appropriate sacrifices. Job praises God. Job shows the appropriate humility and obedience in the face of God's awesome majesty. Job is thankful, and Job praises God, and God is well pleased with Job. Now, at some point, and it's not exactly said when, and in some place it's not exactly said where, the devil starts talking to God. And the devil says to God, the only reason Job really likes you, and the only reason he sacrifices to you and praises you, is because you've done all these good things for him. If you hadn't sent him a lovely wife and a lovely family and flocks and wealth and land and all the things that a man can have in this world, he would never be faithful to you. This faith is really a sham. It's really a way of him getting more favors from you. Now, it becomes kind of strange here. Apparently God and Satan make a bet. Now, it never gets explained why anyone would want to make a bet with God, since he knows everything already, nor is it clear why anyone would make a bet with Satan or how Satan got into it. But bracket that for a while. I think they're trying to tell you a different story here. The key issue in Job is this, that God gratuitously sends down to Job a terrible series of catastrophes. His family gets stricken with diseases and with invasion, and they're killed, and his possessions are scattered, and his house is burnt down, and he loses all the lovely things he has. And he's afflicted with boils and pains and diseases and all the evils of the human flesh. And all through this, Job is completely faithful and constantly praises God, saying, I know my status, God. Whatever you send is right. God is God. Man is man. I will never transgress the boundary and blame God, because that's the ultimate blasphemy, that man should judge God. The point here being that whatever God sends a human being, doubtless, if there is a God, a providence running the world, there's a reason for it, and we ought not to dispute with the deity, telling him how to run the universe, because we are as earthworms to God. We do not have the same level of consciousness, and for us to inform God that we don't think he's running the world properly is the height of impertinence and would be the last and most vicious of actions within the framework of religious faith. Job is the man who holds back, who constantly has faith in God and constantly praises God despite the ills that beset him, which he knows somehow come from God, but which he does not blame God for. Job's friends tell him, you ought to blaspheme, Job. We don't have the same faith that you do. Job's wife tells him, look, Job, curse God and die. That's all that's left for you. Job says to his wife, he says to his friends, you don't understand the nature of real religious faith. I'm Job, that's God. I'm going to be God's faithful servant. So what he ultimately decides to do is to just sit there and take it and constantly praise God. Well, at the end of the story, oddly enough, this has a happy ending. God is very well pleased with Job. Why? Because Job, as a human being, has shown the greatest of human virtues, which is religious faith. Under the burden of all disenchantment, under the burden of all anxiety, under the burden of all misery, the point of Job's patience, the point of Job's faith, is to teach us that the perfect virtue of the person who adheres to biblical religion is faith in God under all circumstances. Job is God's faithful servant. And that's the mythos. That's the central virtue and the central good person in biblical religion, or one of the central good people. Now let's take an alternative to that. The man who shakes his fist at God. The man who wants to be like God. The man full of Greek hubris. Let's take the perfect Greek man. And there are, again, a lot of choices here. We could choose Achilles from Homer, great heroic figure. We could choose Odysseus because he was smart as well as being tough. That's another alternative. But my choice for the perfect Greek man is Prometheus. Prometheus, the man who's not quite at the level of the gods, but would like to be. And although he knows that he's somehow subordinate to the gods, he's still the man who wants to move himself up. Instead of having the humility and the faith that was characteristic of Job, Prometheus is the man who shakes his fist at the gods, the man who disobeys the gods knowing he's going to be punished and doesn't care. He's the man who wants to be something more than human. Prometheus is a titan who felt sorry for the human beings when they were being created because they weren't given the advantages of the animals. They didn't have claws and teeth. They didn't have the swiftness of deer. They didn't have the coloration of chameleons. They didn't have anything going for them. Prometheus liked human beings, and despite the fact that Zeus says that you can't bring the fire of the gods, you can't bring this divine spark down to human beings, Prometheus deceives Zeus. Prometheus goes against what the greatest of the Greek gods tells him to do. Prometheus says, I'm going to do what I will. It's pure satanic will. Those of you who have read Paradise Lost and who understand what it means to say that I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, understand what the Promethean element is. Prometheus is an important Greek myth because it says what the Greeks really are. If you think of the Greek pantheon as not being an enormous and omnipotent creator god, but in fact being personifications of the forces of nature, when Prometheus shakes his fist at the gods and says to the greatest of the gods, I will master you, I will defy you, I will see the day that you die, what the Greeks are saying is that the day will come when the drive to make human beings divine, that the day will come when the drive to make human beings more than they are will succeed. We will conquer not just the pantheon of the mythological gods, we will conquer the forces of nature, we will conquer blind chance, and we will somehow be more than men. This is the heroic temptation. In Greek tragedy, this is called hubris. This is that pride. This is that overweening desire to be something more than you ought to be, to break out of the bonds of nature and to become something more. This megalomaniacal pride, this desire to be something more than merely human, is the essence, is the core of the Greek approach to the world. It defies God, it defies nature, all in the name of increasing and enlarging and improving the world of human will and the world of human action. The world of Job is an entirely God-centered world. Men are but insects within such a world. They don't count for very much. Within the Greek approach to things, the gods are fictions, or if they're not fictions, they're at least the kind of nature forces that we can somehow get around, that we can somehow supplant and make ourselves superior to them if we but have sufficient daring and sufficient will. All of Greek heroism, all of Greek epic, all of Greek tragedy is derived from this essentially satanic pride. And here I don't mean satanic in the sense of being evil or devilish. I mean satanic like Milton's Satan, a man who, or a creature who would be more than human, but somehow can't quite be at the level of real godhood. These are titans. These are men who want to be something more than human. The whole Greek project of creating secular knowledge, of mastering nature, of reaching the fundamental axioms of mathematics, of enlarging the realm of free, untrammeled rationality, all of these ideas are caught up in the image of Prometheus. So when we braid together the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem, we are really asking ourselves, do we want the virtues of Athens or do we want the virtues of Jerusalem? Do we want to be like Job or do we want to be like Prometheus? And there's a problem here. This is something worth your consideration as you let the remainder of the lectures wash over you, as you think through what you're being told. That the human psyche or the human soul is made up of a heterogeneous set of components. We have a rational element to us that allows us to do our taxes and allows us to do geometry. We have an emotional element in us which allows us to appreciate poetry and allows us to fall in love. We have the desire for religious illumination. Testimony to that is the fact that we have constructed the religious systems, the religious art and architecture that we have. We have many heterogeneous desires and many heterogeneous elements built into our psyche or our soul or our mind. And insofar as we exclusively focus on just Job or just Prometheus, insofar as we wish to be just Athenian or just derived from Jerusalem, we have locked ourselves into an either-or alternative that I suspect is not entirely satisfactory. Different sorts of philosopher, different sorts of philosophical discourse, different sorts of thinking offer us different sorts of pleasure and different sorts of improvement. In other words, do not make the mistake of thinking that all edifying philosophies start from the same assumptions and come to the same conclusions. I think that that is a fundamental error. In fact, there are alternative sets of assumptions and alternative sets of conclusions which may well be contradictory between themselves, and yet listening to them, thinking about them, and letting them do something to you, by actually engaging with them, you may be edified in different kinds of ways. It may improve different elements in your soul. In other words, different kinds of thinking are good for you. The great philosopher Wittgenstein once said that philosophical illnesses usually stem from a dietary deficiency. They stem from a situation in which our intellectual diet is deficient in examples. If we constantly think about religion and religious texts and religious issues, we may well have a dietary deficiency that is lacking in scientific or mathematical examples. Similarly, if we were to be extremely positivistic, organize our thinking only around physics and mathematics and formal logic, it may well be that questions of good and evil, questions of human history, human destiny, what's good for both individuals and societies, it may well be that questions like that will escape us if we were exclusively scientific in our orientation. So what I would plead for here is, first of all, an open mind, a willingness not just to be edified when you hear a philosopher telling you what you already believe. What I'm asking you is to have the courage not just to hold the convictions that you do, but the courage to attack your convictions, to call your convictions into question, to ask yourself, suppose I'm completely wrong. Suppose the other set of assumptions or the other set of conclusions is the real one. How would I know? Am I really certain about what I think I know? If you do that seriously, if you sincerely apply yourself to the tradition of Athens and to the tradition of Jerusalem, I think you will maximize what a course of lectures in the history of Western philosophy can potentially offer you. If you don't at least make the attempt to extend the set of your assumptions and to extend the reach of your conclusions, to include not just what you believe now, but the alternative set of beliefs, or the set of beliefs that you've had some doubts about in the past. At least think through the possibility of what it would be like to believe that. Ask yourself what the pluses and minuses are. And if you want a kind of formula for intellectual honesty when you confront these and other questions that we'll have to deal with in the next 63 lectures, you might want to constantly ask yourself the following question. Do I believe this issue? That's called the issue XYZ. And then secondarily, what would count as evidence either for this proposition or against it? If you are willing to look for evidence in favor of what you believe and also evidence in favor of what you do not believe or in favor of what you reject, the intellectual honesty that you will bring to these issues will benefit you both in your understanding and in your capacity to absorb these works, because understanding is just the first stage. After you understand, you have to absorb, and after absorbing the message of both Athens and Jerusalem, then the question is action, and that's outside the realm of these lectures. What we're going to move to next, in the next set of lectures we do, will be the pre-Socratic philosophers. What is important about the pre-Socratic philosophers is that they are the earliest example of the Greek drive to create secular knowledge. We are indebted to these Greek physicists for the foundations of the sort of science that was developed in the Renaissance and later, and for the secular, skeptical, rational element in Greek culture, which continues on in the Western tradition right through to today. Thank you.